Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the second annual Cundill Forum, sponsored by the Cundill History Prize, by the Dean and Faculty of Arts at McGill University, and also by the Department of History and Classical Studies at McGill University. I'd like to thank up front, if I might, two of my colleagues in that department, Faith Wallace and Jason Opal, because they have very much imagined this forum into being. It's thanks to them that we're here in some sense. This event is the second of three events in the Cundill History Festival. Many of you, I think, might have tuned in to this afternoon's amazing lecture by Julia Lovell, the winner of last year's Cundill History Prize. And tomorrow you can tune in to hear the announcement of the winner of this year's, the 2020 Cundill History Prize. And we're, sandwiched in between. So my name is Catherine Desbarras, and it's my great honor to be the moderator of this year's Cundill Forum. So I'm a historian here at McGill University, a specialist of early modern colonialism. And I had the great pleasure of serving as a Cundill juror in 2010 and 2011. So I know just what is involved and the really difficult task that the Cundill jurors had before them. So the Cundill Forum, this is a panel discussion on a theme of public interest that involves the craft of history. And so it's a moment to bring together the finalists in the Cundill History Prize. And I'd like at this point to echo the chair of this year's jury, who said that there may be a lot wrong with the world right now, but thankfully the writing of history is not one of those things. And I think if you want an antidote to doom scrolling, do pick up any one of these books. They really will. They'll get you thinking. So the theme that we chose for this year is As Statues Fall: Heroes, villains and victims, and the challenges of history. Most of us have been following these debates. We've seen the extraordinary images of Edward Colson's statue falling into Bristol Harbor. People in Canada have witnessed the statue of our very prime minister, the first prime minister of the country, pulled down against the backdrop of defund the police demonstration. And the first prime minister of Canada is closely associated with the residential school institution, which was such a catastrophe for Indigenous people in this country. So the panelists that we brought together today, they are all experts in the history of slavery, colonialism, and exploitation, or some combination of those themes. And each one, every time they sit down to their computer, faces these difficult pasts. They're thinking about them, but they're also acutely aware, by virtue of the subjects that they deal with, of what societies choose to remember, and also what societies choose to forget. And I might use a stronger word, possibly disavow. They're also acutely aware of what's at stake in our discussions of these questions, the passions, and also maybe as historians, they're sometimes frustrated by the ways in which, by the kinds of historical claims and simplifications that come up during those discussions. So in one way or another, they're extremely well placed to help us navigate, these questions. So let me introduce the panelists. And begin maybe with Vincent Brown. Vincent Brown is Charles Warren Professor of American History and also Professor of African History and African American History at Harvard University. And his book, the book that is being honored here and nominated, is Tacky's Revolt, called Tacky's Revolt: The Story of an Atlantic Slave War. Our second panelist is William Dalrymple. And William Dalrymple is a prolific, also a prize-winning historian, also a critic. William Dalrymple's book is entitled The Anarchy, the Relentless Rise of the East India Company. And our third panelist is Camilla Townsend, who is Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University. And Camilla Townsend's book is entitled The Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs. And as just to repeat, each one of these books has been nominated for the Cundill Prize. So let's turn to the questions at this point that I'd like to put to you. And in coming up with these questions, I've consulted colleagues, but also was inspired by a course that's being offered here at McGill University. And as we run through this forum, I do want us to have the students of history in mind, and we're partly talking to them, and I'd like to welcome them warmly, any of them who are listening. So at McGill University, there's a course given that is called Memory, Power, and Place. It's taught by a political scientist, Juliet Johnson, and by a geographer, Benjamin Forrest. And when these students get together, one of the first question that they addressed together was a very simple one. And it was, why do people care so much about statues? And I'd like to broaden the question a little to have us think more broadly about landscapes of remembrance. And in that spirit, I'd like to address the question in the first instance to Vincent Brown. I think it's fair to say, Vincent, that your entire body of work, in some sense, has dealt with landscapes of remembrance. And you're extremely attentive everywhere to geographies, and you've done a lot of work to sort of restore specific geographies of transatlantic slavery. So if I could address the question to you.
Yeah, that's true. Well, first, let me thank you, Catherine, for that lovely introduction. And it's fantastic to be on this panel and to be a finalist with these fantastic historians, Camilla Townsend and William Dalrymple. I'm just really honored to be in discussion with you. So thank you. I want to go back to that first question that the students ask in that course, which is, why do so many people care about statues, or why do they care about them so much? And what is it they care about when they go to look at a statue? And I think a lot of the issue is that, we associate commemoration and sometimes memory generally with honor. And that we look at these commemorative statues, these sculptures, we look at these landscapes of remembrance, and we want them to reflect who we are, right? By reference to who we've been, or probably better yet, who we think we've been, or who we want to have been, which is a way of reflecting our aspirations of who we can be, right? So there's a kind of aspirational affect that attends to the way people engage with sculptures, the way people engage with landscapes. They really want to see the honor of their own societies in these honors conferred upon the past. But of course, that's not really the only way to look at the past. It's not the only kind of relationship one can have with the past, nor is it the only kind of landscape of memory that people engage with very deeply. And the other is a more haunted imagination of the past, right? Where memory doesn't simply confer honor, it doesn't necessarily commemorate those things we admire about past figures, but it also serves as a parable, a warning about things we want to avoid. And certainly those people who haven't had the luxury of shaping the landscape just as they please, putting up statues in their honor and the honor of their ancestors and the honor of the people they admire, right, have had a much more intimate relationship with that haunting kind of landscape of memory, right, where the landscape provides warnings, it provides threats, it shows us, right, what we don't want to do. And I do think that kind of memory probably can help us really think about why it is that people are talking at cross purposes when they go to look at a statue like Edward Colston's statue, right? So Edward Colston, for those of you who don't know, was a philanthropist and merchant and gave lots of money in Bristol to its founding, but he was also a slave trader, and quite a prolific slave trader at that. And there were years and years and years when activists would go to the Bristol's version of the city council and try to contextualize that statue, try to get people to think more about his slave trading activities as well as his philanthropic endeavors. And they were met with resistance. And finally, these activists decided to tear it down and throw it in the river, right? Part of the problem there is that the people who were defending that statue simply as evidence of history, and a history they wanted to commemorate, didn't think that they needed to regard the history of slave trading, right, as their own history. That was something they thought they could, as you said, disavow and keep separate. And they were forced to confront this by those activists finally. But I think that there are conversations we can have, maybe starting today, that allow us to engage those different types of memory together so that we can actually come to some common understanding about how we want the landscape of remembrance to reflect our common values and our common aspirations for the future.
Camilla, do you want to add something to that, either to the hopes, the hopes of what this could look like in the future, or back to the question of, you know, why are statues such flashpoints?
Well, just very briefly, and I too want to say thank you. It's truly an honor to be here with you and with the other two panelists. I think that Vincent Brown has said perfectly what needs to be said. The only thing I would underscore is that, as he said, people are looking for honor, for their sense of self, their sense of who they were, who they wished they'd be. He uses the word aspirational. I guess I would say push that further, that concept even further, and say that people are choosing elements of their past too. That is, very few of us on Earth today descend purely from one group or another, and indeed part of what we're arguing about is not only with each other, but we're even in some cases arguing with ourselves about our sense of which part of our past, okay, we choose to identify with. And so then the discussions and the feelings become even more complex. Okay? But I'll keep it short because I know that you have a great deal of territory.
Arsenal, yeah. William, how about you? Do you want to say anything on that, on this first?
Well, I live in India where there's an incredibly complex debate at the moment, because not only do you have an imperial British past, which is obviously deeply problematic for everyone brought up in India, you also have a Islamic and a Mughal past, which for the last 70 years has been regarded by the Nehruvian liberal governments as part of Indian history, but which are now being looked on by the current Hindu nationalist government also as outsiders, as people that came and loot and pillaged. And so the past is full of difficulties and complexities. And the question of who could be commemorated, is it appropriate that a Mughal emperor should have a road named after him in the middle of Delhi? I mean, the British roads were instantly renamed on independence, but names like Shah Jahan Road or Aurangzeb Road and so on have all been changed in recent years. So you have and it's a similar situation in a sense to Israel-Palestine, where the name of places, the names of villages, the monuments have all been manipulated and changed and given new identities. So I think it's an incredibly important role for historians to try and teach these different truths, and to remember all these different layerings of history. All three of the finalists today have written books on the evils of European colonialism. But in many parts of the world, it's not a two-story or it's not a binary. The past contains more complicated traps, and finding a way to negotiate all that is the task that historians have to find their way through.
Right. So my next question was going to be, and I was going to address it to you, William, but you've already stepped into it. And that is, do historians have a particular role to play in these discussions to kind of clarify things? They tend to kind of reduce to simple conversations about individuals, moral absolutes, the heroes, the villains. And they do gloss over the kinds of complexities, William, that you've just alluded to. So, has so many spaces, and the community, my own home community from which I write, is one indeed where people have trouble coming to terms with the fact that one can both be a colonizer and colonized at the same time. But this is excruciatingly difficult to convey, and many people just can't swallow it or process it. It has not been swallowed or processed here. So perhaps I can open this up, or no, first maybe William, back to you, because you have intervened very, very forcefully and particularly on the specific debates over this, whether to, remove or not the statue of Robert Clive. So could you maybe tell people a little bit about that, and how you wrote a very, as I say, a searing article in The Guardian. Can you just, what was going through your mind, and what did you choose to pack into that very dense article?
Well, in Britain, we have a completely different problem to the one in India, which is one of amnesia. It's an astonishing fact that people outside Britain find very hard to grasp, but I think even those of us that write history in Britain are amazed by. But the British Empire is not taught in British schools at all. You can go through 10 years of British history lessons and come out with only the vaguest impression that Britain waged war on every continent and subjugated peoples and committed atrocities and did all the other things of empire across the globe. You get there's a tiny module about the emancipation of the slaves, but not really about the slave trade. So again, the impression is that you learn about Wilberforce, but you don't really learn about Colston. You get a little bit of Florence Nightingale, and then you go to the Second World War, where the Brits are the heroes getting rid of fascism. So British kids are brought up with a myth that their nation has always been on the side of the angels and done only good liberal deeds across the globe. And the whole history of the subjugation of the Indian subcontinent, the story of the slave trade, the story of all the other horrors around the world, from Tasmania to Africa to all the other places where British troops have fought and subjugated, is simply not known. And so you have this problem where, in a sense, the last thing left standing are these statues, but they are unmediated. They're not explained for a contemporary audience. So something like Clive standing outside between Downing Street and the Foreign Office, in other words, absolutely in the dead center of power, sits there without a plaque, without any explanation, and it just says Clive of India. Now, most people in Britain no longer know who he is. It's because they don't learn about him in school, but he's a deeply problematic figure. He's someone who presided over a famine where maybe as many as 5 million people died without a single soup kitchen being set up. He initiated the change of the East India Company from a trading company to a territorial conquering military power. And his statue stands immediately between the Foreign Office and Downing Street. So anyone coming out of the back door of Downing Street or going out of the front door of the Foreign Office, it comes across this figure in the center of power, as an example. And what's fascinating is that at the time, he was deeply reviled. He was regarded as a moral vacuum. He was called Lord Vulture for presiding over this famine. And he ended up committing suicide, having been railed before Parliament. But rather like the Confederate statues that came up during the Civil Rights Movement, Clive's statue came up just as British rule was slipping in India, just as the Congress was beginning to rise to power. And so it is a statue which not only represents a dubious man, but it represents a dubious moment when, in a sense, the British are shoring up their power in India. And so you mentioned this article. My argument was that this is an opportunity to educate. That if you were to create, for example, a museum like the wonderful African American Museum in DC and use objects of empire to educate a generation on the many terrible things that have happened, that can be a positive outcome statues can be used, and the other stuff of empire, the material remains of it, can be used to educate and to warn.
You know, listening to you, I can't help thinking of what Annette Gordon-Reed, the author of The Hemmingses of Monticello, has said on the subject too, that she too has argued that perhaps we should think more in terms of using these as moments to educate, put up plaques that explain, that if we simply change the name of a building, say, that is named for a slaveholder, we will forget his name, we will forget the slaveholder, but she says we will also forget all the enslaved people who did all the work, who maybe built that building. And so she has wondered aloud, is it better simply to put up a sign that explains more? I think about this often as someone who studies Mexico, who studies a complex, formerly colonized world, in the sense that one of the most famous examples there concerns, it was about 30 years ago, I think, some students in Coyoacan, which is on the outskirts of Mexico City, took it upon themselves to literally pull down a statue of Malintzin, or Doña Marina, the indigenous woman who translated for Cortés, Hernando Cortés, on grounds that she was a sellout and a traitor to her people, having sided with Cortés instead of the indigenous. But of course, what nobody knew then was that the Aztecs had enslaved her. And through that enslavement, she ended up in the hands of Cortés. And so she was perfectly willing to act as a translator for people who were going to bring down those who had made war against her people and enslaved her. That, her real situation was that she was simply a girl trying to survive her own enslavement and then perhaps bring down her people's enemies. So at times, as an academic, one can be tempted to think at our role here is to tell people more about this past rather than encouraging them to make snap judgments. I still think that what has happened recently, especially in May and June, deserves other kinds of comments. That our role is perhaps to be more supportive than to be the voice of complexity. But I'm glad that you asked us about that element.
Well, and you really amplified, Camilla, something that you said earlier about how these commemorations, how these memories are always highly selective, yes, and often quite politicized. And I'll tell a story that I think that you would appreciate, William, which is, when I was doing research on Jamaican slavery in the early to mid 1990s in Great Britain, I was staying with a friend of mine, a white college-educated guy, British guy, married to an Indian woman. And that's going to be significant when I tell you the story. And when he learned what I worked on, he said, so why is it that Jamaicans speak English? And his wife said, colonialism, you bloody idiot. Why the hell do you think I speak English, right? And it is because, as William said, that with decolonization, British primary schools and universities even stopped teaching the history of empire. And so people were led to believe again that Britain was this kind of island chain off the peninsula of Europe. And so when people started showing up from the former empire, from West Africa or the Caribbean or South Asia, lots of British people were like, well, what have they got to do with us, right? So they didn't even understand that history of interconnection that empire was still playing out, right? So I do think that one of our roles is to show people that, these commemorations are highly selective and we need to knit the world back together, right? To understand people's interconnections so that we can actually have dialogues about who we should admire, who we should aspire to be, and who we should commemorate in order to make the landscape reflect our values.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to remind our audience that we'll go through a round of questions here put to the panelists by me, but we are going to open up the conversation. So please, if you have questions, you can convey them by email or at cundill.prize@mcgill.ca or use the hashtag Cundill Forum. And I think that will be flashed in front of the screen to help you with that. Okay, let's carry on. Again, I'm talking to historians. They think about the past, not just about what's going on now. So many of the figures around whom controversy swirls, but by no means all, are fairly recent ones, at least by the time frames that historians operate in. Cecil Rhodes, Robert E. Lee, first Prime Minister of Canada, these sorts of figures. Monument building has been going on for a long time, though there may have been a kind of apotheosis in the 19th century and early 20th century for a variety of reasons. But iconoclasms, the destruction of statues, getting rid of these potent places that seem to pack so much into them. That's been going on for ages. And Camilla just alluded to where I'm going a second ago. What is particular about the battles over statues that are going on right now? What is specific, what is going on? And what do we need to be thinking about right now as we take stock of the world around us? And Camilla, as somebody who reached the furthest into the past, you took us to the pre-Columbian Aztec past and urge us to go there. I toss it to you.
Well, I guess I wasn't going to begin in the pre-Columbian past, but indeed, I think we could argue that this question of arguing over monuments does go way, way back. In fact, so the Maya stelae are nothing more than public relations statements and monuments designed to bring their audiences in to believe in it, to guide their beliefs in certain directions. And in wartime, they tore down each other's monuments. So it does go way back. But what I was going to say, what I've been thinking about, and it'd be interesting to me to see if the panelists agree or not, it does seem to me that we are seeing something different since May and June of this year. That is, that what we have is a long history, at least in the past few decades, of intermittent struggles, certain groups becoming enraged and understandably so at different moments and different causes. Okay, who is this guy Columbus, or that guy? My dormitory, if I'm a college student, is named for a slaveholder. It has risen, it has fallen. A statue is changed, a statue falls, the world moves on. My sense, though, as of May and June, is that, and since looking at world news since, is that we are in different territory now. That we are in a situation, finally, perhaps I could say, in which at least half the people feel that we have seen the pain that colonialism and enslavement has caused, and that it is time to remove from our built environment any dominance on their part, that it is time to take it down and move past, okay, to allow a world in which we imagine a built space completely differently, and to not have anybody live in the shadow of images, live underneath or next to images that they find painful. Okay? Equally true, though, given that we're finding statues falling left and right and in all sorts of places, but equally true, we have a minority, a large minority, I think fewer than half, but it's unclear. I mean, electoral politics indicate too how closely drawn we are. Okay? We have other people who are fighting harder than ever, creating parks to preserve these toppled statues, etc. I think. And this will be, this is the part that I'm not sure about. I'm just thinking about this, and we'll see if anyone agrees. I think that these national relations or relations between groups writ large, in some ways are akin to personal relations, to relations between individual people. When you think about your own life, each and every one of us, we have been able to move through painful pasts in general when both parties acknowledge the horrendous nature of something that has happened, that it acknowledged that it did happen, except that one party was hurt much more deeply than the other. Some regret is expressed, okay? And then there can be an agreement to set aside that house, that item, that a relation, whatever it was, and move forward without any looming physical reminder of it, even sometimes with an agreement not to talk about it now that we have faced it. My sense is that about half of us have acknowledged the extraordinary agony caused by colonialism and unequal relations, but that the other half, and this would be akin to personal relationships, does not have the confidence or the self-awareness or whatever it takes to do that. And so are even more dug in, okay, and unwilling to attempt to set it aside and move past. I'm not sure that there is a relationship to sort of the relations between real individual humans, but I think that there might be. Okay? If that is the case, then we're going to have to figure out how to talk to those many people in my country, and I think some substantial minorities elsewhere too, okay, who still feel very defensive, very protective, very unwilling to let go, okay, of visual reminders of what they have been proud of in their past. Okay. But I think we're there, we're getting there. Right?
Vincent, how about you? You started us off with notions of honor, and we've been thinking about disavowal as well. Is any of this relevant, or what do you see? What do you see going on?
Well, I'm encouraged by Camilla's optimism. And I do think that there are moments when we see a kind of awakening and a reckoning with the past, with the darker parts of our collective past, and perhaps even a willingness to do something about it. But what happens in the aftermath of that awakening, that dawning, is down to how politicians and how people with influence organize those sentiments. And quite often what happens after that is people recoil. And they again learn to fear the people that they've traditionally seen as their enemies, right? So one can see the justification, right, in the kind of uprising that takes place after a police murder, and still fear Black people, because there is a very long tradition of anti-Black fear and even anti-Black militarism that really is continuous throughout the history of North America, from slavery on to the present. And which way that goes, whether or not people, again, align with their better angels, or whether or not they retreat and recoil into their fear, partly depends on the people who have influence to organize us. And I don't know that there's one inevitable direction or another. So there's that piece of it. I also think that it's important to recognize, as we've all been saying, that the landscape of commemoration, right, is something that people feel deeply about. And when they come to fear the people they've identified as their enemies, they want to entrench those mythologies, those landscapes that are familiar and comforting to them, those things that give them a sense that they're aspiring to something great, right, that has happened before. And I don't think that we should have any illusions about how easy that conversation is going to be.
William?
Yes,
not easy.
Right. I mean, when you go to Germany, you don't expect to see statues of Adolf Hitler or the Nazis sitting on a podium, and I do think there are certain kinds of atrocity which should mean that you really do have to respond by not having these people honored and put in public places. And there are in public places in Britain people who today, if hauled before the court in The Hague, would be put down as out and out war criminals, people who flayed people alive, people, really, really, really bad stuff. And I think, in a sense, at a certain point, you do have to say this is completely beyond the pale, that you cannot have these people honored today in the 21st century, that there are certain things that people have done in the past which are so bad that there's really no discussion to be had about this. And it's, I'm thinking of, 1857 to 8 was the what in India is known as the First War of Independence, what in Britain is still called the Indian Mutiny, and it was the largest anti-colonial revolt in the world in the 19th century. And it was put down with unbelievable savagery by British troops. Rooms where British people had been killed, the captured rebels were made to lick up the blood. They were then sewed in pigskins and blown from cannons and tortured. Unbelievable. People that did this are still standing on podiums in Glasgow, in Belfast, in London, one in Trafalgar Square. And they, I feel strongly they really shouldn't be there. That you're not calling for a mass destruction of the past, but you are saying that there are people there are statues standing today that really must not still be standing there. They have to be taken down. They have to be put in a museum or explained or something. But I think there are certain lines which historical figures can cross where you just can't. You must work very hard to make sure that the statue is taken down or explained.
Right. And surely the story has something to do also insofar as it's happening in Western Europe or North America, just with the sort of difficulty for so many people to process the fact that places, nations that they have, clung to dearly as being at the vanguard of liberal democracy, we're offering the world democracy and all these wonderful things, and yet in our, we have been the agents, or in our own backyard, all these things have been happening, and it just, for so many people, it just doesn't compute. Partly as a result, as you say, of the national education curricula that just don't cope with so many of these stories that are happening on an imperial transnational scale. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask you to talk, in a sense, a bit about your own work. The Cundill Prize is honoring each of you, not just for impeccable scholarship, but also for your capacity to reach a broad audience. And it has something to do with your writing, but it also has something to do indeed with clearly the juror's sense that you've written books that we need in some way. So could I ask you to just think a little bit or articulate for our audience what you did or tried to do to connect with a broader audience that does seem to have a taste for stories of heroes, villains, or what have you. So taste for simple stories maybe, but you've told complex stories, yet compelling ones. So can you tell us a little bit about how, as historians, you kind of shaped what it is that you crafted? And anyone to jump in, maybe Camilla, shall I start with you?
Sure. Yes, there have been many books about the Aztecs. I guess the answer on the surface that I probably should give is that I based this history on sources that they wrote themselves in their own language without any intention that the Spaniards or any other Europeans would ever read them. But doing that perhaps was important, but it wouldn't necessarily help connect with readers. And I think I hear you, Catalina, you're suggesting that if it's important in our role as historians that we help people get the information and the broader perspectives, right? And I think in my case, what was important is that I showed a history that moved. I showed a history that changed over time. The classic book about the Aztecs, and this would be true actually of many stories of many colonized peoples, is to sort of freeze them in time. The famous example is the book, These Were the Sioux. Here's what they were like, snapshot, okay? As if they don't have their own political arguments, if they're not constantly changing, dealing with colonialism, responding in savvy ways. So you can't open my book and find a chapter, this is their religion, this is the way they did business or had long distance trade routes, this is how they thought, what they thought of the Spaniards. On the contrary, they move just the way all people do. They change their minds, different leaders argue with each other. And my sense from talking to people who read the book is that they liked that. They liked finding out that people who don't look like us, talk like us, think like us, or laugh at the same jokes do have that same kind of fluid history and motion and story with action, okay, and differences among the people. So I think that's what I did, but I guess I'll have to think harder about the question.
Yeah, I think that's what you did.
Pick up on that, because I think Camilla's bringing up something important about histories that are seen to be kind of extra European, which is this idea that non-Western peoples, or so they've been called, are frozen in time. Right? And so one of the things that I was trying to do was really introduce African history into the Americas in a way that, there are people hacking away at doing this, but a way that I think the general public really hasn't really gotten an understanding of yet. And this is in part because, even as far back as the early 19th century, the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel proclaimed that Africa forms no historical part of the world. And when the historical disciplines were established, right, African history just wasn't really a subject. That was the province of anthropologists, along with these other peoples who were supposedly stuck in time, who didn't show historical movement in motion. It's not really, again, until decolonization, anti-colonial rebellion, and civil rights movements that we get a fully fleshed out African and Black history within history departments. And so one of the things that I think I'm trying to bring to general audiences is this understanding that not only African culture, not only kind of folkways matters in the Americas, but African histories, what's happening in these African polities in the era of the slave trade that then plays out in the Americas. And I think it feeds into what I was saying earlier about these histories of interconnection that I think people are so hungry for in an era of global migration and transnationalism, to understand how these kinds of connections have played out in the past, how we got to this place today where there's no one-to-one correspondence between nation, language, people, between blood and soil, right?
What about, just to stick with you for a second, Vincent, I mean, you did something quite powerful also, which was to reframe the story of slavery as a story of war. And that's something that, you know, stops people in their tracks and forces them to recompute much of what they think they know when they think about slavery. Yes, exploitation, yes. And part of the appeal, seems to me, of all your books in some respects is going beyond, you know, talking about exploitation, the evils of the system, but looking at the people affected by them as fully fledged human, political, moral, passionate actors, and reframing the history of slavery as war was a very, as I say, one of those things that kind of stops you in your tracks and forces a lot of recomputing.
Well, I'm glad you recognize that. I'm glad you appreciate that. Thank you. I mean, I think the crucial thing there is thinking less of slavery just as a condition, right, as a status, and even a hereditary status, and more thinking about it as a predicament that people faced, right? And a predicament that had at its core the permanent violent domination of those people who had been enslaved. Now, it just so happens that there were lots of people who described slavery itself as an extension of war, including the famous 18th century abolitionist and autobiographer, Olaudah Equiano, who said, you know, when you make people slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. And he wasn't the only person who said this. There were enslaved peoples around the Atlantic world who also talked about their condition as being a low intensity war. And so what I did was just to take that seriously, and then see this slave revolt as part of all of these other wars that were going around the imperial Atlantic world. And as it turned out, the slave revolt itself was just a war within many other wars, including what Winston Churchill and historians since have called the First European World War, which was a 7 years war between Britain, France, and Spain. And historians hadn't really considered this slave revolt as part of that war, despite the fact that many of the soldiers, sailors, and Marines who suppressed the slave revolt in Jamaica had fought in more famous campaigns in Quebec, in Senegal, in Martinique, and Guadeloupe, and then sailed directly to Jamaica to suppress this slave revolt. The British Royal Marines, who were newly reorganized for the 7 Years' War to fight amphibious conflicts, had their first battles in Senegal, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Jamaica, fighting Black people in the bush. So kind of once I had the optic of seeing this slave revolt and slavery itself as war, it became much easier to integrate these conflicts into this larger world of European warfare. And then to get, I think, directly to your question, to use some of the genre conventions of military history that people already appreciate and identify with and know how to read, to get them to read something else. So not the standard history of European battles, but a wholly new kind of warfare between European empires and the enslaved.
Right. I see some of that going on, William, in your book as well. I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of military history, but you give us a corporation with cannons and guns.
Well, it's the same world war as in Vincent. The 7 Year War was what started off the East India Company's move from being a trading organization to being a sort of conquistador like Cortez. And yes, it's a corporation. That's the thing that's been forgotten, I think, in a lot of the history. People still talk about the British in India. Well, the first 250 years, it wasn't the British government. It was a corporation that existed only to make profit. And so the East India Company had no raison d'etre, had no reason to be in India other than to make large sums of money for its officers and for its shareholders. And so you instantly lose all the rhetoric that develops around the Raj and the rest of empire, the idea of a civilizing mission or anything. The company wasn't interested in that at all. It didn't even pretend to be. It was there to make fortunes for its officers and the shareholders. And so part of the story I'm telling is a story about corporate malpractice, corporate corruption. The East India Company invented corporate lobbying. The East India Company invented bribing MPs. And within a century of it, it's the first corporation. It begins in 1599, and within a century, in 1690, it's caught bribing MPs and offering them share options if it'll extend its monopoly. It's the first corporation that realized it was rich enough and powerful enough to topple government. So the sort of thing that, you know, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was doing in Iran in the 1950s, or the sort of thing that United Fruit were doing in Guatemala in the 1950s, the coup that brought about the phrase banana republic, because United Fruit wanted to get rid of a socialist government that were doing land reform. Or the sort of thing that ITT was doing, bringing in the CIA to topple Allende in Chile in the 70s, where a corporation is basically instigating the toppling of a hostile government. The East India Company invents that. So it's the first big multinational. It's also the first big multinational to run amok. And then in the middle of all this, on top of everything else, something that Julia Lovell, earlier this evening, has written about in a previous book, it becomes the world's biggest narco operators. Well, you know, forget the Medellin cartel. They were just sort of, you know, in a sandpit compared to the East India Company and the opium trade, where they were taking great areas of North India, growing opium, selling it to the Chinese illegally, then seizing Hong Kong as an offshore base to sell their narcotic, and then shipping the tea, which they buy with the profit, to India, to Europe, and to North America. So it's East India Company tea that ends up in Boston Harbor at the beginning of the American Revolution. So it's the story it's a familiar tale. In a sense, it's the same story as Avatar, or, you know, one of those movies. It's the story of an evil corporation that just runs amok.
Right. So we have a new villain.
We do.
I have lots more questions, but I think it might be time to open it up to the audience, the broader audience that's listening. So I'm going to try and see if I can. Okay. So we've got one. We've got one from my colleague, Brian Lewis, a British historian. Question, let me just read it. I agree with William Dalrymple that those guilty of the appalling atrocities he mentioned should be toppled from their pedestals. But what about the arguably more marginal cases? William Hesketh Lever, Lord Leverhulme, for example, has been targeted because of the use of forced labor in the Congo and the Pacific. Should he be toppled? Leverhulme buildings be renamed? Leverhulme scholarships disappear?
Well, these are really complicated and difficult questions. And, you know, it's not for me or any of us here to decide these issues. People elect governments to, in the end, it's our job to instruct and to educate and to research. But it can't be us, in a sense, drawing up a hit list. But it seems to me that, you know, that it's quite easy to say that war criminals and mass murderers should be in a different category to other people. I don't think, you know, there are certain limits beyond which I think you know, you have to draw a line. However much different ages looked at with different moralities and the reality that, you know, in a sense, all governments in the pre-modern world were empires.
I've got one here from one of the students in the course on memory, power, and place. A student by the name of Pierce Young, asking, taking down monuments is one step, but what do you think should come after? What should the standard be for what we put in a fallen monument's place? And do you think that emptiness sends a strong enough message, or should we seek to replace it with a counter monument or acknowledgement. So once again, you're being asked to sort of deal with these really practical questions. Any thoughts on that one?
I guess, I don't know. I just want to throw out there what the Mexicans have been doing actually for the past century. I mean, but it started in their great Mexican Revolution when they tore down the Porfirio Diaz's government. We know that Mexico is famous for these fantastic murals. I mean, Diego Rivera would be the most famous, but there's so many, including currently indigenous artists in almost every town constructing their own murals. And they don't aim for one message. They aim for beauty, for complexity, for lots of different people, lots of different things going on. And I think it's fair to say just about everybody loves them. They love the colors, the action, the sense that the dead are with us still in a good way, that is that the past is not entirely gone. So perhaps that's something to think about, that there might be alternate forms of art that might be conducive to expression, to full expression, to multiplicity of expression, and not simply to sort of recreating an onerous past. We certainly wouldn't want to substitute probably one statue for another. That sounds like a battle nobody wins.
A battle nobody wins, indeed. We have one.
I'd
actually like to just add a kind of an addendum to that.
Why don't you go for, go for
that question. And this might sound like an evasion of the question, but I'll explain why it's not, which is that I do think that if we can work toward more just and equitable societies where we can be having collective conversations in common about what's important to us, then these kinds of commemorations don't become a zero-sum game, where if you build my monument, you have to lose one of your own. And so I know that may sound a bit Pollyanna-ish, but I think that that's the direction we want to move in. It's a broader move towards social equity, where people don't feel like they are threatened by the building of someone else's monument.
Right, and maybe just if I might slip in one that I had earlier, and that is, can you give us some examples of forms of commemoration that actually seem much more fruitful and productive in the direction of recognizing, maybe a democratization, narratives other than kind of triumphal ones that don't leave any room for people who are not recognized by certain forms of institutional power. So any that you can, I mean, William, you already mentioned you mentioned the museum. Any others that you can think of?
I mean, our job is to write. All three of us are writers, and that, in a sense, seems to me to be the fundamental job here: to research, to dig up these paths, the extraordinary work Camilla has been doing with the lost Aztec languages, recovering those voices. In a more modest way, I've been using a lot of Urdu and Persian sources. The great thing about the East India Company, this corporation, was that it was a fantastically good keeper of records. There's 35 miles of East India Company records in the British Library alone. But to that, you have to give, you have to find the counterpart, and they're there too. There's, the Mughals and Indians in general in the 18th, 19th century were fantastic writers of histories themselves, and many of them are sitting there in languages which are no longer really spoken in India, particularly Persian, which used to be the language of government and used to be the language of literature, but now is no longer, and fewer and fewer people can read these texts. But they're there in large numbers in the British Library, but also in the National Archives in India, in small provincial libraries, and going out and retrieving these histories and writing about them and writing about them in such a way that people actually want to read them. I think one of the wonderful things about the Cundill Prize is that it does put a premium on the writing being accessible. And although it's fantastic to write great scholarly history for other scholars, obviously it's incredibly important that this writing reaches a wider audience too. And a world where you have only nuanced history being read by scholars is one where ignorance can fester at a popular level. And so to be able to provide good scholarly history, but in a way that people want to read and will pick up a history, but rather than reaching for a novel or Netflix. It seems to be an important part of the job that we're talking about here, of commemoration and remembrance.
Right. So can I just maybe put that to Camilla and to Vincent as well? I mean, do you see, you're writers, you're historians, your weapon of choice in a sense is the book. And so do you in some sense see your job as contributing to these discussions of commemoration? Do you see your books as acts of commemoration in some sense? And commemoration, it looks like in the direction of recovering stories that have been lost.
Absolutely. It's funny. I was thinking as Vince spoke earlier, that he was being modest, but he said that he reconceptualized Taki's revolt as a part of a great war because of the words of Olaudah Equiano and other Black men of the 18th and 19th centuries. And the main theme of my book comes straight from the pens, from the mouths, from the creative imagination of the indigenous writers who were my sources, who said over and over again, please may this stuff be found. They meant by their own great-great-great-great-grandchildren. Please do not forget, not just that we were here. They knew that we would know the Aztecs were there, but please, world, do not forget that we were complex, that we were human, that we fought back, that we had our own agendas, that we had cultures that with fine arts and fine ideas of science that you folks will never know about because you destroyed us. Okay? But please, remember that this happened and feel something about the fact that we may have been, forced into oblivion. They said things like that. So I think, yes, it is essential that we now write books that render those memories permanent, that commemorate what they wished to have commemorated.
Right. And you address the descendants of the Aztecs in your final sentence, do you not?
Absolutely.
I think final sentence.
The present day indigenous people of Mexico have had to live with a weight and the weight of insult, not only the weight of their peoples having lost the war, but the weight of the insults that have followed and that continue to follow. I mean, our current president has said things about all of Mexicans that he could only fathom saying, and his hearers could only fathom hearing, because they're so accustomed on some deep level to think of the sort of primordial savage that is supposed to be the Mexican. Okay? It is essential that we break that wrong idea, okay? and offer a memory of what was really there. Judging from your face, I think we must be at time, but
quite no. Okay. I'm trying to decide. There's a rather long question here, so maybe I'll go for it. I'll go for it because it might be the last. So from Mike LaMonica at McGill, graduate student, something that's very easy for us as historians to forget is that most people's experience with history is produced outside academia, and I might extend that to say outside books. Things like statues, films, popular stories are often more real to people as a recounting of the past than an article published in name your journal of choice or even a book by Oxford University Press. How can we best use our expertise to engage with popular conceptions of history and rectify the silences and gaps? Is such a thing even possible when the very nature of truth and objective fact is so hotly contested? Addressed it to Vincent Brown.
Well, it's a big question.
It's a huge question, but it's
a big question, but it's one that I do think about a lot, in part because the history of slavery was not taught in American primary schools, and it was not taught much or well in high schools. And so the first lessons I learned about the history of slavery were from reggae musicians, folks like Bob Marley and Peter Tosh and Burning Spear and Steel Pulse in the UK. Right? These are the people who really introduced me to the subject that became my life's work. So it would be silly of me to say that the only way one can learn this history or be inspired by it is through books. I do think, and I endorse everything that William and Camilla said, that writing is a technology that endures. And so when one wants to think about monuments to the past, writing is a good way to do it. It often endures longer than buildings do, longer than statues do. And so I think that we shouldn't be shy about heralding writing as a commemorative technology that's of great value. But again, thinking about the forms that in which people receive their history, which are transmedia forms, which are in music, which are in film, which are in television, which are in those landscapes, I think historians could engage those much more directly. And I've started a unit at Harvard University called History Design Studio, where we think about how it is that one can still be a professional historian, think about how we use primary source documents produced contemporaneously with the things we're trying to describe, engage deeply in arguments over the meaning of the past with communities that are interested, use evidence responsibly to make arguments and tell stories, but then tell those stories and make those arguments in a variety of media forms. I think that we haven't spent enough time as professional historians thinking about how to do that. And I very much appreciate the question that pushes us in that direction.
Thank you very much, Vincent. That's, I think that takes us to the end, but that's, I think that's a lovely note to end on, especially with students in mind. It's a reminder of the horizons that they can shoot for, the areas that they can aim for inspiration. Bob Marley inspired you. There are many directions through which one can cultivate the historical imagination, and I think that's worth thinking about and talking about. So thank you to the three of you. Thank you for engaging with the questions and for your extraordinary books. And I can only say, people, please go read the books. They really are truly wonderful and very, very, very thought-provoking. So thank you. And thank you to the audience for your questions. And I know there were many more that we couldn't get to. Maybe a closing thought. Do stay tuned tomorrow. Come check in tomorrow for the announcement of the winner. As they say on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, I think the NPR show, you're all winners here. So thank you very much. So tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll find out who the Cundill jury has awarded with the first prize. And that will be the final event of the Cundill History Prize Festival. Final note is simply to thank all of the patrons and supporters and organizers who've made this event possible. And if I could single out behind the scenes, Mackenzie Bleho and Stuart McCombie, who've held our hands throughout this, and perhaps also finally, a nod to the Zoom deities. I think everything went as well as it could as far as that's concerned. So thank you so much, everybody. It was just such a pleasure to listen to you and to meet you. Thank you. Bye.
Likewise.
Thank you, Catherine. It was an honor to be with you all.
Thanks, guys.
Be well.
See you tomorrow.